Good evening. On behalf of the board of the Jacksonville Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Jerry Spinks, the president of the Historical Society. Our goal on these programs are to present little snippets about the history of Jacksonville and some of the people, and today some of the machines that actually participated in our history. We're going to talk about a race car and a schooner and the men that built them and raced them and how they had a great effect. Our first segment will be, our guest in our first segment is Randy Kimberly. And Randy, thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate it. Randy has a real passion for race cars. And in the 1930s in Jacksonville Beach and many other locations around Jacksonville, auto racing was a major occupation and activity. Randy, when did you first learn about all this racing and how did you come about to be interested in it?
Well, here, this car that we're going to talk about today is a car that was built here in Jacksonville by Mr. Moyer. And the reason we found it was that a truck driver called a friend of ours in Escondido, California, who then called us and said, there's a car in your backyard by Craig Field. So we went out and talked to Mrs. Moyer, and she wanted to sell the car, and the car was in her garage and had been for the last 41 years.
Well, let's just talk about where it all started. The photo we're looking at now is a scene at the premier spot for auto racing in Jacksonville. What am I looking at, Kim?
You're looking at a race down at Jack's Beach, and that was about 1931. And the lead car, the Bantam that you see in front, was owned by a gentleman here in town, and he owned a distributorship for Austin Bantam. Our car is number 88, and it's about the second one in, standing behind the gentleman there, and with Bert Moyer in the cockpit. And they had beach races down at the beach, and they were called barrel racers.
Randy, what in the world is a barrel race?
They put barrels out on the beach, and they raced around them.
In a figure eight kind of style?
No, just, around like a racetrack.
So there was a lot more sand there.
A lot more sand. The beach was a lot wider then than it is today.
Oh, I wonder if they had a permit.
I don't think so.
Wow. Well, where else in town did they do the racing?
Well, they also raced, which is now NAS Jack's, and downtown, which was at the amusement park, and down at, of course, Daytona and New Smyrna Beach, up in Atlanta, and other various small tracks around the north of Florida and the south of Georgia.
The amusement park, would that have been the Dixieland Park downtown?
That would be the Dixieland Park where Mosh is today.
Mosh in that area right there. Mm-hmm. So that was all part of that great carnival scene down there.
You bet.
Well, let's take a look at number 88 and tell us who is here.
That is Bert Moyer's wife, and she's sitting in the car as it was being constructed back in 1930.
Wow. Now, let's talk about this car and how ingenious people were at that point. This is made up of how many different kind of cars?
Really, it's only made up of about two different kind of cars. Chevrolet has a Chevrolet engine, transmission, or axle. It has an Essex frame and a homemade body with a whippet cut-down radiator.
Lord. What do you know about Mr. Moyer? Did he have a skill in this, and did he come here from Jacksonville?
He was a local from Jacksonville. I'm not too sure what he did himself, but obviously he had a lot of skill in putting the car together. It was a car of the period. It was more or less what you call a hot rod of the period.
Randy, to give us some proportion, these were racing at the beach. They were racing at Naval Air Station, Dixieland Park, Daytona, Atlanta. This was very much a big sport at that time. How big was this car relative to something you can give me a reference point today?
Well, let's put it this way. It was smaller than a Volkswagen, and that gives you some idea of the size. It only has a 96-inch wheelbase, and it's only 67 inches wide at the widest track.
Well, let's meet Mr. Moyer in the completed car.
And this was taken down at Jacksonville Beach during a race down there, as you can see. You can see a little piece of an old car over to your right, and that's a car of the period.
Wow.
So it's very nice. Now, Simplex also was a piston ring manufacturer here in the United States. They're still in business, believe it or not building piston rings. And they helped sponsor the car along with the Wook or Pep family, which was a local gas company out of Alabama.
Well, this is really amazing. I heard a story about something called straw hat racing.
Oh, yes.
Where was that?
They had quite a neat deal. As a fun thing, each driver was issued a straw hat, and he was to race around the track with his straw hat on his head, but not held on with his hand. And the first one to lose, of course, their straw hat, was disqualified from the race. And the person who won, of course, had to have his hat still on his head and not assisted by anything.
Lord, what great days in that thing. I'm going to, we'll see how great the camera is right now, but these programs, which you have a whole collection of, and one of the amazing things about this story of finding and restoration is that the Moyers had all of this information, didn't they?
Oh yes, Mrs. Moyer had all the information in a big photo album, along with pictures and programs, you know, all his licenses, entry forms, everything, letters from prospective sponsors, all that sort of thing from around the Northwest Florida.
I wonder if the professional auto racers are doing essentially the same thing today with much smaller scale.
I think they're probably doing millions of dollars today against hundreds of dollars in those days.
Wow. By the way, how fast did this car go?
About 100 miles an hour. Of course, you had to have...
On sand?
On sand.
That would be amazing. Now, hopefully the camera will help us share this little piece of the old Jacksonville Journal that's right here. This is concerning a race, isn't it, Randy?
Yes, that was the advertisement for the upcoming race at down at Ponte Vedra. And there's, of course, a gentleman there who raced down at Ponte Vedra. He also drove our car at times, and there was about 3 people that drove that. And he was one of the leading drivers up in the northeast part of Florida.
Well, this paper also shows us another small part of Jacksonville's history. And the lead story on this day, besides the auto races, was the baseball game at Durkee Field. And Durkee Field, as many people know, has been restored. And I believe it was home for several major players that went on to play in the major leagues over the years. Let's take a look at the end of the road. If you can zoom in on this shot, Randy's going to tell us about the time and the effort and some of the stories about the restoration. This is the car that, as it is today.
Yeah, we've come as close as we could to keeping it all original.
Right.
And when we found it, it had an engine in the frame and the front axle, and that was it. The rest was in boxes and stacked up on inside of a garage. So we were going to send it to the gentleman out in Escondido to restore. Well, he couldn't do it, so it turned to me, and so I did it in about 650 hours, along with Jimmy Britz, who did our body for us. The other body was so salt-ridden, naturally, that we couldn't use it, so we had it recreated down to the wells, which were not very good, and Jimmy had a real hard time making the wells real bad. And then the hood he also made for us, because the hood was missing. The straps were done by Tandy Leather here in town, and the paint was done by the Loose Note rep out of Tallahassee.
What other ways have you been able to show this piece of Jacksonville history?
Well, we've had it up to Amelia Island twice. Bill Warner and I are both in the car together, and he is co-chairman, naturally, of the Amelia Island Concourse. So we've had it up there once to unveil it for the Moyer family.
Right.
And their whole family.
Wow.
And it was the grand opening, if you wish. And then last year we had it up again with a whole lot of cars, a whole class of cars that raced on the beach.
Well, I think after all of the work you've done, you are convinced that racing was a major occupation or a major sport here in Jacksonville.
It was. You know, a lot of people did it, you know, for fun. A lot of people went to the races for fun. They had thousands of people down at Jack's Beach, you know, for the races. It was amazing, the period.
Well, it's also in context. This was not a great time in our country, 1929, 1930s.
I know.
So it was good sport and recreation.
It was a great outlet, for the mass population of Jacksonville.
Randy, I really appreciate you sharing all this with us, and I'm hopeful to get copies of all of this for the archives, and one of these days we'll interview the Moyers. You were very good to have found and kept all this material. So
It's our pleasure. It's great.
Absolutely. Now stay tuned for the second half, and we're going to talk about a major yacht and a businessman who made a major influence on the city of Jacksonville.